Welcome everybody to the fifth lecture in our 2024 installment of our Scholars in the Square series. Hello to those of you who are with us through Zoom, especially if there are any people from India, welcome. Welcome to those of you who are joining us in the future through YouTube, and to those of you who are here with us this afternoon at UVic. After a 20-minute talk by Arvind Kumar, Dr. Nilesh Bose, a colleague from our history department, will join Arvind and me for a 20-minute conversation. And then we'll spend the last 20 minutes in an open discussion. Our speaker today is Arvind Kumar, a CSRS graduate student fellow and a PhD student in our law program here at UVic. Arvind's in the final phases of his PhD in the law program. Before he started his PhD, he completed his LLM at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai, and his bachelor's degree in law at the National Law University in Lucknow. His dissertation, as you'll hear about today, deals with the ways rabbinical readings of Hindu texts solidified the subordinate position of the Adivasi community in India. Now, the Adivasi community, as many of you will know, is often described as India's indigenous population. And through the work of Arvind and others, its members are more able to see how they have been positioned in a very particular way in India. In this way, his work echoes the work of many scholars in Canadian indigenous experiences. And so I would like to acknowledge now and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Sanghees, the Esquimalt and Osage peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. So please join me in welcoming Arvind.
Thank you, Paul, for that introduction. And thank you everyone for coming here and showing your interest in today's talk.
Louder.
So the topic I'm trying to share with you is like a little difficult for me as well, because I'm thinking of two communities, the Adivasi community as Paul spoke about, but I'm also thinking about my community, how these communities are thinking about certain stories, narratives, cultural narratives, which has been there in the Indian society for very long, and how they have been like deciding their position in the Indian society, and how they are like struggling against those narratives to make space for themselves in the Indian society. So in this presentation, I mean, the purpose is to highlight like two major points. First, like in my understanding, that more than British colonial narratives of Adivasis like as savages and backward people, I believe that Brahmanical stories have also played a very important role in the stigmatization of Adivasis among the general Indian masses. So that's why I'm like arguing decolonial approach alone is not effective when we are thinking of the stigmatization attached to Adivasi identity in India. Consequently, like including a de-Brahmanical approach could effectively make sense of Adivasi grievances in the past and contemporary times. So there are like three terms you must have heard, like Dalits, Adivasis, and Brahmanism. So I will just like give a brief introduction about these three terms. So Adivasi is like, sorry for the shot, it's visible. So it's like Adivasis are the de facto indigenous people in India. So the Indian state doesn't recognize any group as indigenous. I mean, there were like discourses about indigeneity, maybe pre-independence, but at the time of independence, the Indian state decided that everyone will be treated as indigenous. But these communities, particularly the Adivasi communities, who they're also being referred to as like tribals or tribes, they have also been claiming their rights over their land and territory based on their indigeneity claims in the Indian society at the national level and also at the regional level. So the Indian state doesn't recognize the term Adivasi, uses the term scheduled tribe to provide certain constitutional privileges and protections and benefits on the basis of historical marginalization. And it's a huge population, 8.6% of India's population, approximately 106 million people. And it is a very heterogeneous community. It's like made up of like maybe around 705 Adivasi and tribal communities. So there are two groups, one in the northeastern of states of India. They prefer to be referred as tribals, but the community I'm talking about, they are like mostly in the central eastern part of India. I mean, you can see in the circle where the state of Jharkhand, where I work with the Adivasi community for my field work. So I'm not thinking about presently about the tribal communities in the northern eastern states. I'm mostly focusing on the tribal groups who are residing in the non-northeastern states of India, who refer to themselves mostly as Adivasis. And so, as I mentioned, that my PhD is like focused on Adivasi's claim for indigeneity, but I'm also like trying to bring the question of Dalit identity and positionality as well, because they are also like there have been discourses about indigeneity within that community as well. So how and their ideas and Adivasi idea are differing or conflicting with each other when they're thinking about indigeneity discourse. So Dalits are the erstwhile untouchable or caste groups who have suffered the stigma of being impure and being untouchable, and they have suffered the stigma of untouchability for thousands of years. This is also like a very heterogeneous community, but they are being clubbed together as scheduled castes by the Indian state in the constitution to, again, like to provide protection, constitutional privileges and benefits. And this is also like a very huge population, 200 million people are there. And now I'll just give a brief introduction about Brahminism and the caste system. So I'm using the term Brahminism, not using the term Hinduism. So by Brahminism, I mean that tradition, let's say within the larger Hindu tradition, which believes in a caste-based social order, and where a person's caste is like decided based on their birth, and the hierarchy is mostly based on the idea of purity and impurity. So Dalits like lie at the very bottom of that caste pyramid. In fact, you can see that they lie outside the caste social order, and they have been treated as untouchables. So as you go up like higher, the privileges increases. As you go like lower, the privileges decreases. So this is like a basic idea, but there have been like narratives within the Dalit narrative that Brahminism and Hinduism are same, or they are being synonymous due to their shared caste-based social order philosophy. So this is the maybe a brief introduction about these things. So this is the research gap I have been like trying to address in my in this paper or part of this study. So the central focus of my study is like to underscore the need for to recognize Adivasis' right to self-government. In the field of law and society, the Adivasi demand for self-government is possibly rooted like in three major arguments. Firstly, that the Adivasis are the indigenous people who lost their autonomy over their society and land due to administrative and legal changes brought about during British colonial rule. Secondly, Adivasis were not given their due place in post-colonial India. And thirdly, that Adivasis post-colonial laws and governance systems, like the post-colonial laws of the Indian nation, they have failed to do justice to Adivasis because they are rooted in colonial worldview. So that's one of the reasons why people are asking that Adivasis should be given the right to self-government, to rule their land, their territory, their society as per their own laws, as per their own governance systems, which is rooted in an Adivasi worldview. And based on these three arguments, there is an understanding that Adivasis' emancipation in the Indian nation lies in the realization of their right to self-government. But one can see that these discourses regarding Adivasis' historical marginalization and their emancipation in the Indian nation are primarily rooted in the critique of what happened during British colonial and the post-colonial laws and governance systems. Not only the laws and governance systems, but British colonial policies are also responsible for the perspectives held by non-Adivasis towards Adivasis in today's India. This approach is widely referred to as the colonial approach in Adivasi studies. I'm in like total agreement with the colonial approach, keeping in mind the chaos and destruction brought by the British colonial rule in Indian society. However, this approach fails to provide answers to some questions I've been facing as a Dalit and as a researcher who has been working with Adivasi and tribal communities for almost eight years now. So what are these questions that convince me that there is a need to live beyond the colonial approach? So one of the questions like I've been dealing is like, were the Adivasis living in complete isolation with no contact with non-Adivasis prior to the colonial era? If the answer is no, then what guided the social relationship between Adivasis and non-Adivasis? or more importantly, like what guided non-Adivasi perspectives towards Adivasis. So this takes me to my primary query: are non-Adivasi perspectives really guided by British categorizations of Adivasis as savages, uncivilized, backward people, or forest people, or are there pre-colonial and existing socio-cultural religious narratives that are the reason for the demonization of Adivasis in India? So these dilemmas make me question the over-emphasis on a pre-colonial approach we use in Adivasi studies. And one of the reasons is that, because there is historical evidence about Adivasi's engagement with non-Adivasi communities. And also there are a number of Adivasi stories that speak of their experiences with Adivasi society, non-Adivasi societies. So consequently, I believe that there is a pre-colonial history and cultural narratives that we need to take into consideration while we are trying to understand and make sense of Adivasi grievances in contemporary India. And accepting the pre-colonial history and cultural narratives vis-a-vis Adivasis will help us understand that the categorization of Adivasis as savages, barbarous people in need of civilization has a longer history than the colonial period. And this acceptance makes me think of the dominant pre-colonial socio-cultural religious narratives which have created the other in the Indian society. And this is where my engagement with the Dalit and the anti-caste movement made me think about the Brahmanical tradition, which has remained a dominant tradition in Indian history and has left a deep impact on the psyche of Indian masses. In Dalit imagination, long before the colonial era, Brahminism has been creating the other in Indian society based on its cardinal philosophy of caste-based social orders. And there are like many scholars of Sanskrit and historians who have pointed about the references about the forest people who are living in the forest areas, who have been depicted as demons, who has been depicted as uncivilized people with no culture. There's another history, like another narrative when we are thinking about the Aryan theory in context. Because one of the origins of the Brahmanical tradition is traced back to the people who moved into India around 1500 BCE, writing the Sanskrit texts, the early Vedas, and they are interacting with the larger Indian masses before Brahmanical tradition became synonymous with India or the Indian civilization. So these are the reasons, and I was thinking, like, is it like just an anti-caste perspective, which I'm thinking about when I'm thinking of Brahminism and the Adivasi issues? But when I went to the field, there are like many stories which, like the Adivasis are, also telling about their relationship with the caste-based society, and like when they're thinking about their past. And also, like, I was thinking why I'm trying to bring the big Brahmanical approach is because the Adivasis are like fighting against the Hinduization of the Adivasi groups in Jharkhand. So for that reason, to have an understanding about how Brahmanism appropriates social groups in the Indian society is very much important. We really wanted to understand about Adivasi's perspective towards the Hinduism or Brahmanism. So one of the villages, like I found that this is a like a stone slab which was like put out there, and it categorically mentions, they have mentioned that the Adivasis are not Hindus and Hindu laws does not apply to them. So it's one of the way to protest or to claim that don't appropriate us within the larger Hindu tradition. Adivasi tradition has its own existence. Maybe there are similarities like nature worship, or they're worshipping animals, but it doesn't mean that they are part of the larger Hindu worldview or philosophy. And this is one of the festival I just wanted to mention that. This festival is like about remembering their loss of kingdom, the last kingdom they hold in Jharkhand, which they lost to the upper caste Rajput kings. So they like organize this festival to remember that moment, or to remember their last king. There's like a whole story behind that. And the story is like, it's not about like, it's not like about being sad about celebrating the festival in a sad mood, but they are celebrating that they lost their kingdom because of the treachery of, they use the word like the Brahmanical treachery, because the thing that the Brahmin advises to the tribal king, through schemes, they made ensure that the kingdom passes into the hands of the Nagvanshi dynasty, or the Rajput dynasty. So this is some of the ways they are trying to like remember their history in terms of like the Brahmanical caste society. There's also like an attempt by the Hindu groups there who are saying that this festival is about worshipping the Indra god, which is like a Vedic god. So some of the Adivasi people mentioned that they are using the when taking the benefit of the similar words like Ind and Indra to appropriate our festival, to appropriate our history, or to like Hinduize our history. So they are fighting against all that also. So that turban thing represents the turban. I mean that long pole. It represents the turban of the king as a symbolic way to remember their last king, and they dance around it and they sing around it, and also like it's about claiming that land because it's mostly like dominated by the Hindu society now, the Hindu groups who have migrated to that area. So through dance and music, they claim that land also. And this is like a very popular story. Maybe it has not been part of the society in that region, but it is more like has become a narrative within the Dalit and the Adivasi community. So it's about, I mean, the festival of Durga Puja is like mostly celebrated by in the cities within the caste Hindu society, as as a victory over evil by killing a demon king Mahisasura. But in Adivasi and Dalit narrative, what they say is that the Mahisasura was an indigenous king who was killed at the hands of the Aryan goddess. So I visited the Mysore in in south of India. So that narrative is more prevalent among the Dalit communities. But when I came back to Jharkhand, it is more prevalent among the Santhal community. So I was not working on the Santhal community. I was working on Munda community. So Munda community has don't have very much references about this story, but the Santhal groups who are situated there in small pockets, they remember, they told me about this story, but it is mostly celebrated in the Purulia region here, I think the West Bengal. So this these people who are in the women dresses, they mourn the death of Mahisasur throughout those 9 days when Durga Puja is celebrated in the cities. The story is the king was murdered or kidnapped, and they lost their Santhal kingdom. So they danced for 9 days, searching for their king, and in that hope that they will find their king someday, and get back their land, their kingdom, their rule in the region. So that's one of the other stories. So this is why I've been thinking we are thinking about the Adivasi grievances in present India or in the past also, without taking into context what the impact of the dominant socio-cultural narratives among Adivasis. It's very hard to understand, get a full picture of their resistance in contemporary India or maybe past also. And deep Brahmanical approach is also is important for me, because when you are taking the indigeneity debate to a next level, when we are, because it's not just restricted, limited to the Adivasi community. It has also been misused by the Hindutva forces in India to impose Hindu laws and colonial systems on the Indian society under the garb of decolonization or Indianization. So unless and until we understand what lies at the center of the Hindu texts, for example, Dharma Shastras, one of the very famous known Sanskrit scholar of Dharma Shastras, Professor Donald Davis, I've been engaging with his work, and he's very categorically mentioned that Dharma Shastras are something which they are very they protect the caste-based social order. They put the caste-based social order at the idea of justice, equality, and fraternity. So the grammatical approach may be like more prevalent in the Dalit narrative, but it also making sense for the Adivasis when they are resisting their Hinduization in present India. So I think it's essential for the larger debate on the colonization of India's post-colonial laws and government systems. Yeah. So, yeah, the whole idea is like there is a need to move beyond the economic approach if we are thinking about the Adivasi and Dalit grievances in the Indian society.
So now we shift gears and we welcome Nilesh Bose, who's a professor in the history department and former fellow at the center. So welcome back. And so this is an opportunity for the two of you to engage in the conversation. I am just here to support and to thicken things up a little bit if things get thin, which I kind of doubt they will. And then we open the floor to broader conversations.
Great, thank you so much for including me in this conversation. So Arvind's topic about Adivashis and a deep Brahminical approach to studying aspects of Adivashi history and politics. I think it brings to light various slices into the diversity and complexity of India. It brings to light post-colonial redress of historic subjugations and marginalizations, a process India is very well known for, but resonant throughout much of the post-colonial world. So, covering this in 20 minutes is easy. I'm sure it'll be no problem. But what I'd like to do in 19 minutes here, or let's say, 15 to 19 minutes, is offer a little of a wide-angle lens into South Asian history that might offer some context to help understand some of what Arvind was talking about. So first, I'll talk a bit about Adivashis, the term Adivashi, how it comes about, why it's important, and then the term tribe and tribal, which was mentioned by Arvind, and then end with a few questions. I'll reiterate a few issues also that Arvind mentioned, but just to keep them on the table so we can have a broader conversation. So as you mentioned, Adivashis number about 100 million people today. That's about 8.6% of the Indian population, which is over 1.4 billion people. Over 700 groups that used to be officially known as tribes are included in this designation. Over 700 distinctive groups with distinctive languages, traditions, and cultural practices. Also, in terms of the political diversity of Adivashis, scattered in some parts of India, in some parts of southern India, in the contemporary province of Kerala, relatively small numbers. In some parts of India, as Arvind mentioned, in the Northeast, in Mizoram, in Nagaland, vast majorities. And in some places, like in Nagaland, the site of long-standing movements for self-determination on behalf of Nagas, who are the vast majority in those places. In some other parts of India, there are groups who bring forth glorious histories. So Gonds, G-O-N-D, is a name of one group that is classified as an Adivashi group today. Bhils, B-H-I-L, they had their own kingdoms. They had all sorts of detailed infrastructure in their histories. And then there are those who do not have such a history of lettered politics or of literacy or presence. In some cases, there are some groups in the history of colonial India in particular who were classified as criminal tribes. There's one group called Kol, K-O-L, and they were classified as such because they were often identified as conducting highway robbery. This is literally what many groups were seen as doing, but also accompanying their practices with various religious rituals. And then they were classified as such because of their robbery and because of religious rituals as a certain kind of group that were then classified as criminal tribes. They are included in this larger constellation of over 700 groups. And then to think about other individuals in the contemporary of India, the president of India today, Draupadi Murmu, is an Adivashi person who hails from Odisha, which is in eastern India, a site of many different Adivashi groups. She was, in her past, she was the governor of Jharkhand, the state where Arvind has conducted research in the early 21st century. And that state, Jharkhand, was created out of a piece of Bihar, turned from southern Bihar into its own state, Jharkhand, which is known for very particular histories of Adivashi peoples, as Arvind implied. So that showcases this vast diversity of social experience and politics in India. Also, for the cineasts among us, those of you who have seen the film RRR, one of the heroes in that film is based on a real-life Adivashi historical person, Komaram Bhim. He's the local hero. There's the policeman, and then there's the local person. The local hero is based on this real-life Adivashi anti-colonial rebel. And that film, as any of you who have seen it or follow Indian cinema know, very popular, and it has a place globally in the media landscape today, the character based on this film. There are other individuals who occupy all sorts of space in the contemporary Adivashi people, many women. One particular person, Tulsi Gowda, a great environmentalist from Karnataka in southern India, has spent most of her life working on behalf of environmental causes as relates to Adivashi people. She is the holder of a Padma Shri award, one of the highest honors that the Indian state gives out to people for their advancement of India. And there are various other Adivashi women who have received Padma Shri awards. So there is, again, this vast spectrum of people who can claim the mantle Adivashi. So moving on to the term Adivashi literally means original inhabitant. And this was a term that was invented. So Adi meaning original, Vasi, Bash, that means living in. So the people who first lived in India. And this is a term that was invented in the early 19th century. So though at times it might denote a timeless communing with nature, as is often the case with indigenous peoples, it speaks to a definitively modern process, as it was invented in the early 19th century by a number of forces. European missionaries who from the early 19th century gained more and more presence in India, the rising East India companies in the early 19th century who were investigating different groups in the frontiers of India, and members of an emergent science later to be known as anthropology, who sought to categorize people who didn't fit into pre-existing understandings of society and culture. So what about this term, and why was it used? The reason that it was initially used was that there were people who fell outside of the then known categories to missionaries, to the colonial state, and to anthropologists. So known categories included people who fit into some of the systems that Arvind mentioned, Vedic and post-Vedic Hinduism, elite cultures of Islam, elite known cultures of Sikhism that had lineages, that had texts, that had all sorts of reference points. People who fit outside of that system, who could not be seen as fitting into any one of those, were typed original inhabitants or Adivashis. And in that moment, in the early 19th century, a congeries of groups came together within this category. The vast majority of groups who did were forest or hill dwellers. And as Arvind mentioned, forest dwellers have a big role in ancient Indian literature, in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and the epic traditions. Forest dwellers are often, they're noted, but they're often seen in very negative terms. But in this modern process of the construction of colonial knowledge, it was also forest dwellers and hill dwellers. And throughout the 19th century, they came to approximate what in North America were seen as tribal groups. And this is seen in the longer history of anthropology throughout the 19th century. Often the colonial state, as it developed in the 19th century, had an antagonistic relationship with forest dwellers and hill groups, often triggering rebellions of various sorts, because the colonial state, as it expanded, sedentized and alienated those forest dwellers from their lands. And this is why they often occupy a political entity. Often those pushes to sedentize by the colonial state were extremely violent, and they triggered rebellions that were known across Asia. There are various people who stick out in the historical record in the 19th century. One such person, Birsa Munda, who is of the group that Arvind studies, the Munda group, in the 19th century, was a part of a massive anti-colonial rebellion in the Bihar-Bengal borderlands, 1899 to 1900, died fighting against the colonial state. And in the subsequent history in the 20th century and 21st, there are all sorts of memorials and structures and statues built to honor this person. Now, with the rise of independent India in the late 1940s, also as Arvind mentioned, when the Constitution of India was written over a nearly 2-year process from 1946 to early 49, the dominant idea in India and in most post-colonial states that were being formed was that of social equality and the eradication of various pre-existing hierarchies. And India is one of those societies in the world that have perhaps more forms of hierarchy than anywhere else in the world. So this was a major undertaking to try to think about how to organize society to eradicate pre-existing hierarchies and to imagine a society of social equality. This was the goal of the Indian Constituent Assembly and of the Indian Constitution. So at that time, when the Constitution was being written, as Arvind mentions, in the 1940s, this vast array of groups of different languages and cultural practices, different histories, was grouped together, and not as Adivashi, but as scheduled tribes. And that also speaks to another aspect of colonial knowledge formation, because one reason why that was done is that scheduled tribes were seen as distinctive from scheduled castes, which is another whole set of groups that were designated by the colonial state through their census machine. But the scheduled castes were seen as suffering from different forms of inherited, let's say, deprivations than the scheduled tribes. And to simplify it, perhaps oversimplify it, it is the question of land and alienation from land that scheduled tribes were seen as suffering from. And they were given certain designated reservations in the Indian system, scheduled tribes were and still are. There are also tribes who were included in the world of Adivashis in the colonial period that were designated as criminal that I mentioned earlier. There was a law, the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871, that was on the books through the independence of India and only repealed in 1952. But all of those groups then were changed in terms of their status, and they are now called denotified tribes, and there are about 100 of those. So that just adds another layer to the broader topic. So just to wrap up this little section here, in the current era, there are various popular images and public figures of Adivashis in contemporary India, like the President of India herself, Draupadi Murmu, or the character of in RRR. And these suggest a range of positive developments vis-a-vis Adivashis, given the public recognition of them. But if we step away from film characters and politicians, and we look at the broader structures of history, we would find a few patterns. One, regardless of where in India groups have been typed as Adivashis, in most cases, they have been dispossessed and alienated from traditional forest lands. The colonial period, due to the push to sedentize by the colonial state, in the national state, many Adivashi groups have been dispossessed due to mining and development projects that have occurred in great numbers in Jharkhand, in Chhattisgarh, and in parts of the Northeast. Also, though there's not a lot of time to talk about this, but Adivashis in various parts of Eastern India have been on the front lines of, and at times in solidarity with, the Maoist Naxalite movements of land redistribution in the late 20th century and early 21st century. Just to add another little piece to the puzzle, there are a lot of Adivashi groups, traditionally forest dwelling, who find a land redistribution program appealing to their politics. And there are many Naxalite Maoist groups who have found willing partners with Adivashi forest dwellers. This is from the 1970s through the early 21st century. Okay, so now moving on over to a few questions for Arvind. So as you mentioned in your opening and in certain parts of the presentation, you place the term Adivashi and Dalit together. And in India and anywhere really in the world, in terms of group affiliation and communalized consciousness are situated somewhere. They're situated in a context, they're situated in a geography, they're situated in a politics. They are not inherent to any person or place or group. So Adivashi, as I've mentioned, it's not a term that exists for time immemorial. It's something that emerges at a specific time, as does the term Dalit, and as do the politics behind Dalit activism. And as you and I have discussed on a few occasions, those politics and those histories are very different, and they bring to light different kinds of commitments. And just briefly with the Adivashi case, the issue of landedness and alienation from land is central, whereas in most cases amongst Dalits, most who have been typed as Dalit have been landless and or outside of such a system that Adivashis have been identified with and been pushing for. So since that is also how you began the presentation, I think it might be interesting to explore that a little bit. If you could say a bit about the benefits of putting Dalits and Adivashis into the same frame, and a bit about the limits of doing so, and what might be gained and what might be lost by doing that.
Thank you for your interesting question and also for the background. So like when I'm thinking about, maybe I'll start with RRR. So,
Right.
So in that movie, like, you know, it seems like they have presented a tribal hero in a good way, but Adivasi scholars have been criticizing that movie for showing an Adivasi hero, taking an Adivasi character, a historical character, and showing it in a very demeaning way by putting an upper caste Hindu hero at level par above that character. So that's like something which explains a lot about like how appropriation, or how the Brahmanical worldview works when they appropriate communities, into that whole. I mean, they will present it in a very. They have presented that movie in a very beautiful way, both songs, cinematography, and it's very hard to understand the real message behind those movies. So that's one thing as I was thinking about. There was another movie, Bahubali, made by the same director, and you can see that how they have shown the villains as black people who resides in forests, speaking like some alien languages. So when you will watch the movie, it seems like, oh, it's just a nice movie, such beautiful songs. But the hidden meaning is like it's like hidden somewhere, and you have to decipher that meaning, how they are presenting those movies. And that's what when I read the scriptures, the Mahabharata or the Ramayana, that's what I see, like in how the Brahmanical worldview has appropriated, the indigenous peoples of India, the heroes, and they have put someone at the top, but making sure that the caste idea or that social hierarchy is maintained by appropriating that hero. Same way, when I'm thinking about Jaipal Singh Munda, or when I'm thinking about the president of India, who is an Adivasi. These are all like just figures to show that, oh, like we have put someone at the top to make them feel that they are part of the Indian nation, and which is actually governed by the upper caste Hindus, and with a very Brahmanical word. When I'm thinking of benefits, like that's where the Adivasis and the Dalit people, they are thinking of together when they are fighting against a nation which is more becoming a Hindu nation. So they are fighting against the hegemony of the upper caste mindset, with against the masses of the Indian masses, which is the Dalits, which is the Adivasis. Limitations, like as you mentioned about the land issue. So I totally agree with that the Dalits have like through thousands of years marginalized to such an extent where they don't have any privilege in the Indian society, no land, nothing. Obviously, like the situation is improving in post-independence India. But the Adivasis always had the land, their territory. So they are within the Indian nation, they are fighting to protect that land, their territory. But they are a very marginalized community. They have land, but it doesn't mean that it's a privileged community. Somebody said, one of the Adivasi scholars said that what the Indian nation is doing, that they are making Dalits out of Adivasis. So Adivasis are the future Dalits in India, when they will know where their right over their land will be stripped off. They will made to work in the cities as laborers, as servants. By taking away the land, they are just pushing them into that social economic category. So the limitation is like the Dalits are looking for privileges, through the Indian nation, so that the Indian nation can help them, to uplift their position by, distributing the resources of the country equally. From where do the Indian nation going to get those resources? So Dalits, Adivasis are the people from where they are taking those resources, the land. So that's like a very big contradiction when we are thinking about Dalit and Adivasis. And also Adivasis are thinking in terms of more like traditional laws, governance systems. But our Dalits have faced like injustice at the hands of the traditional laws and governance systems. So when they are thinking about the revival of these traditions and the laws, there exists a lot of difference. But what I've been thinking is like, for that you need to like take the indigenous debate in like a little deeper, because when the Adivasis, Dalits are thinking against the traditional laws and governance systems, they're actually just thinking in terms of the Brahmanical laws and governance systems. So, and one question like which is always on my mind is like, are we going to consider the Brahmanical tradition, the laws and governance systems, like who are emanating from the Brahmanical worldview to be indigenous or not? Because there are like historians, like for example, Romila Thapar. She differentiates between the Hindu tradition. She calls it an Aryan tradition from the Indic traditions. I think she's thinking in terms of like more Adivasi traditions, Buddhism, Jainism, which has emanated from maybe the present geographical area. But obviously, like, it's a very complicated issue, so I'm not sure like where I stand today. But these are certain things.
Thank you. So now we have about 20 minutes or so left. Thanks very much, Nilesh, for some broader questions. Now, what I'm going to do, so there's a tradition at the center for having a Friday tease out session tomorrow at 11. So I'm going to just encourage people who aren't going to come for that tomorrow to have first opportunity to ask questions. So there are some folks in the room I don't recognize, and if you have questions or if there are questions on Zoom, maybe we'll go to them first. Any other questions before we go to what I'm sure is going to be a brilliant question from Devyani? Okay, go ahead, ask a brilliant question.
Okay. Thank you so much, Paul. Anyways, thank you, Arvind, for the brave presentation, and thanks, Nilesh. Both of you had a very fascinating discussion. Nilesh already stole one of my questions, the Dalit discourse on indigeneity. Now, for those who are not that well versed with the gender aspect, and I'll just give a context to my question. So Dalit women and Adivasi women are hypersexualized in India. There's a lot of sexual violence, and the caste hierarchy just fades away when an upper caste man wants, and this is when polygamy was practiced before Hindu law was codified, when an upper caste man wanted to marry a lower caste woman, especially a Dalit or an Adivasi woman, that hierarchy just faded away. However, for women, they couldn't marry below their caste. Like a Brahmin woman couldn't marry a Shudra man, for example. So have you interviewed any Dalit Adivasi women, and how is if you have, I'm just curious, how is the intermarriage happening between Adivasi and caste Hindus, or Dalit and upper caste Hindus, and both for men as well as women, and what it looks like with respect to property distribution, because you do have the Hindu law which governs property distribution.
Thanks for an interesting question. So like I haven't like interviewed Dalit women because I was working on the Adivasi people for my PhD, but I have like spoken with the Adivasi women there. So like imagine an area which is like highly dominated by the Adivasi community. It's all Adivasi villages around. And then there is like a 5-kilometer stretch, which is the town in that district, which is totally dominated by the caste Hindus. And they are restricted to that town area. But what they want is like, they wanted to buy lands, move further into the Adivasi lands. And Adivasi women are being used as a mean by them. So there you will find fake marriages, fake promises being made to the women, to the Adivasi women, Adivasi girls, Adivasi women, girls being duped into, with promises of marriage. And this is how like they are taking advantages of that. And most of the Adivasi people are living in villages. So it's very hard for them to understand the laws which work in the town area. They're all like, English laws, property laws, and or maybe domestic violence act or anything which they're not aware of. So, but the people living in the town areas, they have good connections with courts, the bureaucracy, the executive, and it is all these institutions are dominated by caste Hindus. So these are very like women have been used as a mean to grab Adivasi land. And one of the girls like was like what telling me that one of the ways is like they will ask the girls to marry, like they marry the girls in somewhere in some temple or something without making the woman or the girl meet the families or the boy meeting the family. And that's how they are like, some things are working out there. And regarding the intermarriages, like I think the Adivasi community is more open than the caste society, Hindu society. They don't discriminate if they are falling in love with any person outside their community. But maybe it's like a drawback which they are going through.
The Adivasi men, are they marrying?
I haven't come across like any. That was not like one of my area of research, so I wasn't like asking many questions regarding this. I attended like some of the women group sessions there, and we were talking about these things because some of the girls were facing those situations. So they were bringing it in the traditional assemblies of the villages.
So Arvind, this will be a kind of a flat-footed question, kind of a follow-up to Devyani's much more sophisticated question, which is that if a girl is tricked like this, what recourse does she have? In other words, is there kind of a state or a federal legal order to which she can complain?
Yes, all the institutions are there. There are like family courts.
Yeah.
There are like civil courts. There is also like the commissionerate where they can directly go, taking their grievances. But the problem is like they don't have access to these institutions because of maybe poverty, because of lack of knowledge, legal knowledge, you can say legal awareness. So it's become like a huge task for an Adivasi girl to take recourse in the existing legal organ and system in that area. So yeah, these are the options. Other options are like they can take the matter with the village assemblies. But that's why I think I showed you the stone slab, right? Mm-hmm. So that was a part of a movement which took place in 2017 to 18, when the state institutions were entering the Adivasi villages, harassing women, the policemen, the military. And that's what the Adivasi people did. Like they put stone slabs at the boundary of the villages that no non-Adivasi is allowed to enter these areas without taking any permission from the traditional assembly, village assembly, or the traditional government system. And yeah, so there is like a big tussle going on between the Adivasis and the state institutions, which is not dominated by Adivasi. In fact, there is no representation. The civil court I inquired, there are no Adivasi judges. Only 3 or 4% are the Adivasi lawyers. So these institutions are like alien institutions still, despite those institutions being situated in the Adivasi areas.
Would there be something like legal pluralism? Because there are a Muslim, kind of a separate Muslim legal regime within India. Yeah. So would there be anything like that for Adivasi traditions, if not rules or laws? But
like legal pluralism is like something which they are obviously like using that for the revival of traditional laws and governance systems, or indigenous laws and governance systems, or Adivasi laws and governance systems. But mostly like these traditional laws or cultural things are restricted to the communities only. They're not part of the state institution.
Right.
I mean, I interviewed one of the judges, and they say that we would take into consideration about the customary laws of Adivasi, about marriage, about property when we are deciding cases regarding Adivasi people. But he was saying that there is no codification of those laws. But the people are also against the codification of the laws because it will freeze them in the moment, the Adivasi laws, which is a very oral tradition-based society, which doesn't have a fixed idea of law, right? Or social customs. It changes as per the need of the village and as per the stories of their, which they have heard. So yeah, I mean, and there are very few Muslim pockets there, but I would say they have been demonized to such an extent by the Hindu movement that there is also a tussle between the Muslim community and the Adivasi community right now.
Okay. Sorry, before we go to Paige's comment, because you just mentioned this question about the concerns around codification. And given that you're at our law program, and right now our law, for those of you who don't know, our law program is a site of some really exciting developments around Indigenous legal orders. We're building an entire building, and it's a really exciting UVic specific thing. And it strikes me it would be kind of cool to have a conversation between some of the folks at the Indigenous Legal Center here and the people you're talking about around the question of codification.
Yeah.
How do you make land in the real world, these traditions that are oral and dynamic? Yeah. Have you thought about that? It seems like a
yeah, I'm working with Professor John Burroughs. We had those discussions with him. And I'm also engaging with the indigenous research methodology they're using for indigenous laws and government systems. And one of the ideas to look at the stories of the people, to find the laws which are hidden there. Because through stories they have been managing their society, the laws are hidden there. Something which is very useful in terms of the Adivasi society, but I don't think the Adivasi society is thinking in those terms yet, the way the indigenous communities are thinking here.
Yeah.
Maybe but I spoke to Adivasi lawyers, and they were fascinated by these ideas. That we need to collect the stories, because as the elders are dying, I mean these stories are we are losing those stories. So they are in very much favor of collecting the stories, codifying those stories. But this idea of finding sources of law in the stories, I don't think it has still it has a long way to go, I think, within the Adivasi community. But yeah, I mean they were very fascinated by what I shared with them.
Yeah. Paige?
Thanks. You kind of touched on something that I was going to ask you, so perhaps this is a good segue. So you talked about their fight for self-governance and for sovereignty, and I'm wondering what kind of collective action is happening amongst the Adivasis. How are they approaching this? Are there rallies? Are there formal things? Are they meeting with government, with lawmakers? And then I guess, are they aware of what's happening in other countries? Part of this you've already touched on. So what's happening in Canada and Australia, New Zealand in terms of Indigenous rights, and are they taking any inspiration from that? Although you've already said kind of a long way to go.
Yeah. Thanks for that question. I think we had similar discussion with Professor Bose also. Yeah, I mean, the movement I spoke about, the Patligari movement, the stone slab thing. I mean, that was the most recent movement where the Adivasis really came in, rallied behind each other to protect their land and territory and to resist the state, from taking away their land, or the dominant society the mainstream society entering in those areas and stripping the Adivasis away from their land and territory. So rallies, these are very much part of that area, and you can see that's the only recourse I think is left with the Adivasi people right now within the Indian nation to raise their voice.
So there's no sort of formal, no government or lawmakers that are willing to actually sit down and have conversations?
So there are Adivasi MPs, which are part of the present government. There are MPs, Adivasi MPs or MLAs, the state assemblies, parliament, like Professor Bose told about the president. But the people I spoke to, like, they really hated those MPs and MLAs because they think that once they reach those institutions, they forget that they are Adivasis. And they hardly care about what is going on in the Adivasi areas. Like in this movement, one of the Adivasi, very like known Adivasi leader, like, yeah, I will skip the name. So, his house was attacked by the Adivasi people because he was the reason. I mean, they voted him that he will make policies or influence the government policies for the protection of the Adivasi land. But he was actually going against those things. So yeah, I mean, there are presidents, we have maybe even one day we have a prime minister, but the Indian state system doesn't have space for the Adivasi demand or the Adivasi imagination of an Indian nation. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, one indigenous scholar here used the term like parasite for the Canadian nation, surviving on the blood of the indigenous people. I think that's very similar what is going on. And obviously, like, I spoke about that they are like very curious about what is going on in Canada. Like when I was asking these questions or sharing my experiences here, they were very curious about how the indigenous people are fighting in Canada. And they're also like aware through YouTube videos and others, like, making themselves aware about the indigenous movement around the world.
Wow.
Thank you, Arvind. I have a question about de-Brahmanization, which I think is conceptually really fascinating to me. Is this a framework that you're using on the research, or is it coming from the communities themselves in terms of thinking about Hinduism? Like I get the totally two frameworks. One, the colonial context that has been violent and the residue of that, and then also the Hindu system. So is the response of saying we need to kind of do away with this something that's coming internally, or is it something that you're seeing from the outside perspective as an intervention?
Thanks it's interesting. Yeah. So, I mean, within the Dalit community, it's an approach which is like this,
Yes.
because of their experiences with
Yes.
the Brahmanical tradition.
Yeah.
So it's not like a new approach which I'm bringing.
Yes.
And I think I should British Ranjan Mani is a historian who I think coined the term.
Mhm.
But when I was interviewing the Adivasi social activists there, I mean, this term is not existing in the villages, among the village people, but they're fighting against the Hinduization. The way they have mentioned on the stone slab, very specifically that we are not Hindus and Hindu law doesn't apply to us. So people are aware about the problematic nature of Hinduization or Brahmanization of the Adivasi society. But the social activists are using it. They are using the term, they are saying that, one of the activists said that though we have never been part of the Brahmanical system or the caste system, but we are not untouched by the Brahmanical forces. So, and it is like a very powerful force, like, dominant force in the Indian society, socially, culturally, politically. So this term is being used by the activists, by the people like maybe who are educated, who are in the academia, but not by the village people. They are thinking of it in some very direct terms, like using the term like Hindus.
So we probably have an opportunity for one more question, and it can either come from the room, or I actually noticed that Nilesh has got two more on his list. Do you want to ask one of them?
Well, they've been addressed to some degree. I had a question about whether you felt that Adivashi struggles were framed in larger global and comparative ways, and I think you've addressed that a little bit. I was also curious, following this discussion of so-called de-Brahminical approaches to knowledge, about whether or not you find that Adivashi appropriations of and subversions of narrative find resonances elsewhere in the larger pantheon of South Asian religions. There's so many vernacular traditions in South Asia, personal devotional movements, and reworkings of worship traditions that do very similar things, but come from within a caste-based order. And I'm wondering if you see any resonances there between Adivashis and other vernacular movements in India or elsewhere.
Yeah, It's interesting and tough, I think. Yeah.
Difficult question, I know.
30 seconds.
Right.
Like, yeah, like when I'm thinking about the Brahmanization of India, I'm not thinking like, I'm thinking I'm going very back, like too back, with the emergence of the Vedic religion. And I was reading one of Professor Johannes Bromka's work. He's an ontologist, and he has a very fascinating idea that though we consider Hinduism or Brahmanism of that time period as a dominant force in the Indian society, but it was only restricted to the northwestern part of India, like the present-day Pakistan or something. It wasn't a dominant force until maybe the 1st century. So thinking of it like a very, and from that I'm thinking like, so before 1st century, till 1st century, there was no Hinduism. So what was India? Like, what kind of traditions were people following in those traditions? And that takes me to very close to what Adivasi people are doing. So that idea of like, the original, traditions. Yeah, I mean, I always think like the way we think of Hindutva, people use it the term Islamization or Christianization of India. I think we need to think about also like the Hinduization of India or the Brahmanization of India, and it will not be possible to understand that if we just keep thinking about, just the recent past, the colonial past, and also like about the divisional movements, like Professor Gail Omwit's work, like when she was thinking about anti-caste thinkers, I mean, she has been thinking about, Kabir, she has been thinking about Govind, about the Bhakti movement, about Guru Radas and everyone, that how they were like, resisting the Brahmanical caste order, which was making space in the Indian society. Yeah.
Okay, please join me in thanking Arvind. That's great. Join us next week, same time, same place, for Sean Kiley's talk, Music and Trance, Mapping Altered States Through Sound. So that should be good fun too. So take care, everyone. See you next week.